happy Sunday. I hope you guys are having an awesome week. As you can see, my little guy is back here with me in the kitchen. Leo and I are enjoying our Sunday. He just woke up from a nap and decided to come join mommy. So today I want to share with you a few kitchen mistakes that you want to avoid that will give you much better results in the kitchen. So Leo and I are going to go over 7 things to stop doing in the kitchen that will give you much better results when you're cooking. So this should be a pretty quick one, but I just was reading an article the other day on BuzzFeed, which was about a few things that people were doing, and they're like, well, why do I always end up with bad results from the food when I'm cooking, and some of the mistakes that they were making along the way, and that things that they realized they should stop doing. So that inspired me to put together a couple tips for you guys on things you should stop doing in order to get better results when you're cooking in the kitchen. So the first thing to stop doing is when you're cooking, adding garlic and onions to the pot at the same time. So lots of delicious things start off with garlic and onions. They create a really great aromatic, they're really tasty, so it's a great way to start a lot of dishes. But the problem is garlic and onions do not take the same amount of time to cook. So when you toss them both in at the same time, the onions take longer to cook and the garlic cooks really quickly and pretty much will burn before you have a chance to cook the onions. So if you are going to cook something with garlic and onions, what you want to do is put your onions in there first and cook them as long as you need to, whether that's getting them translucent or you're trying to caramelize them, however far along in the cooking process you're trying to get them. And then you'll add the garlic, and then you'll move on with the recipe. So garlic, really you only want it in the pan until it gets until you can start to smell the garlickiness, and that happens within 30 to 60 seconds. It happens really quickly. So you don't want the onions and garlic sitting in there together for a long time while you're waiting for the onions to cook. Otherwise you end up with burnt garlic, and burnt garlic adds a really bitter taste. Burnt anything adds a bitter taste to your food that you don't want. So that's why it's important to not cook them together at the same time. First put the onions in and then add the garlic and move on with the recipe. And the garlic, like I said, cooks really quickly, so you only need about 30 to 60 seconds for the garlic to be cooked enough to add the flavor that you're looking for, and then it'll continue to add flavor as you cook throughout the rest of the cooking process. Hey baby! The next mistake we have is not seasoning your food throughout the cooking process. So sometimes I was reading that sometimes people would wait until they got to the very end of cooking like a piece of meat to add salt and pepper and spices and all the different flavors. The problem is by the time you get to the end of the cooking process, the salt or seasonings that you're adding don't have enough time to actually incorporate into the dish, soak into the meat, and at that point they basically kind of just sit on top of the meat. So all the flavor is on the outside, but once you take a bite into the food and you're on the inside, there's not much flavor there. There's nothing left on the inside of the food, so you get bland food that just has a bit of flavor on the outside. So what you want to do is add seasonings from the beginning of the cooking process and then continue adding them throughout where it makes sense. So if you're cooking meat, when you're first getting into the pan, you want to season it. You want to add all of the different spices and flavors and sugar and salt and sourness and acid, all of those things. You want to add them in when you first start the cooking process, and then before you finish, you can taste it again and see, does it need additional salt? It doesn't need other flavors. You can add those again at the end. But it's really important to season throughout the cooking process so you don't end up with food at the very end that is unflavorful and that there's no flavor that's had a chance to seep into the food. So another thing that can help with that is marinating food or brining your food. So if you're making like a piece of poultry, chicken or turkey, brining it, which is soaking it in salted water or seasoned water, so you can add salt and sugar and pepper and all those different things into the water, allowing the bird to sit in that water for anywhere from 6 to 24 hours, and it will start to soak deeper into the meat, and that's one way that you can get more flavor inside of the bird. Also marinating, as you probably have heard of or seen before, just adding spices and flavors to the outside of other kinds of meat. So that could be soy sauce or barbecue sauce. It could be hot sauces mixed with all sorts of other kinds of flavors and spices, and putting that. Also, you want to add an acid like a vinegar, which will help to break down the proteins and get the flavors deeper into the meat. So marinating the meat or brining the meat is something that can also help, and that's a part of the whole cooking process. So starting from there, and then once you're cooking cooking the food, you'll also continue adding flavors in there to make sure your food is really flavorful at the end. The one caveat to this is if you are reducing something, meaning you starting with a liquid and you want to reduce that down to a more concentrated form, that is the one time that you don't want to add a bunch of salt, because if you add a bunch of salt at the beginning and you reduce the liquid, so there's less water in the dish now, you're going to have a much higher salt concentration and it's going to get too salty. So that's the one caveat to remember, is if you're reducing something like a sauce or a soup, that you will add the salt at the end, because you don't want it to get too salty because you reduce the amount of liquid and now this concentration of salt will be too high. Next mistake, not tasting your food before serving it. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the seasoning your food throughout the process. If you are seasoning your food throughout the process and tasting it as you season it, you'll get a much better idea of how the food is tasting. What does it need? Does it need sweetness? Does it need acid? Does it need some heat to balance it out? Does it need more salt? All of those things will be apparent if you taste the food throughout. So don't wait until you sit down at the table with your food to actually taste it for the first time, because then you may realize, oh, this doesn't have enough salt, or it doesn't have enough pepper, or Leo's over here having a snack. He's just found my plate of leftover food and decided he's gonna help himself to my sweet potato. So my little adorable guy, he always makes sure that he feeds himself. So sweet. But yeah, so you want to make sure you taste the food throughout, because then you'll be able to pick up and recognize what the food needs and be able to make that and course correct throughout the cooking process, so you don't get to the end and have food that doesn't quite hit the mark on the flavor that you're looking for. The next thing is cooking everything on high heat. And this is one that I have been guilty of as well. It's like, when you're hungry and you just want to eat, you like turn up the pan to the highest heat possible, get the food in there and cook it quickly so you can just eat. You're trying to eat as quickly as possible. The problem is not everything cooks well on high heat, unless you're doing, something like a stir fry. High heat is often not the best setting for a lot of foods, because the outside of the food will cook really, really quickly, but the inside of the food may not have enough time to cook thoroughly. So if you're cooking things like vegetables, and really hard vegetables like carrots and broccoli, those are really, really tough and fibrous foods that take a long time for the heat to penetrate the inside and make it tender and easy to chew. And so if you cook it really, really hot, really quickly, the outside of the food will get cooked and potentially burn before the inside of the food has a chance to cook all the way. And this can also happen with meats. So if you're having the problem where you constantly have the outside of the food is cooked and gets to the point of burning before you have the chance to cook the rest of the way through the middle of the food. For instance, you cook chicken and then you take it off and it's still raw or undercooked on the inside, but the outside is charred. That is because you're cooking at too high of a heat setting. You want to lower your heat settings, and that will allow the outside of the food to cook much slower, and the inside of the food will have a chance to come to temperature and cook all the way through before the outside of the food is burnt. So you want to make sure to actually adjust your cooking temperature to what would be most appropriate for the food that you're making. And it's different for every food. If you're cooking something like eggs, if you watch my eggs video, we talked about scrambled eggs and the fact that you need to cook scrambled eggs at a low temperature. Low and slow is the secret to really great scrambled eggs. So you want to make sure that you adjust the cooking temperature based on what it is that you're cooking, because different foods have a different level of delicacy. Fish is something that's really delicate, and for the most part, you want to cook fish at a lower temperature and cook it really quickly. But for other foods, you might want to cook them at a much higher temperature, especially if you're deep frying something. Those kinds of things, you'll have a much higher temperature, but you just want to make sure you adjust that. Don't cook everything at the same temperature, because you'll end up with a lot of burnt food. The next thing is crowding your pan. So when you put the food in the pan, you might try to shove everything in there in one go. Like say that you're cooking a whole bunch of chicken, you're frying chicken, or you're cooking, a whole bunch of vegetables, and you're like, I just want to be able to fit it all in one go. I don't want to have to do it in batches. And you try to shove everything in the pan at the same time. The problem that happens when you put too much food in the pan is that you don't have the opportunity to get the caramelization that happens from the heat being up against the surface of the food. So when heat interacts with proteins and sugars, what happens is something called a Maillard reaction. And this is basically this amazing process that creates a sweet, caramelized, crunchy, delicious texture on the outside of our food. That thing that you love about a seared steak, where the outside has that nice crunch and it's kind of sweet and savory at the same time. That is the gold standard. That's what we're looking for from our food. And the problem is when you crowd your pan and you put a bunch of food in the pan at the exact same time, that Maillard reaction is prevented from happening, because instead of searing something, you start to steam it, because as the food is cooking, it's releasing all of the liquids that are in there. The water heats up and it starts to evaporate, which water does once it reaches its boiling point. And so the water starts to evaporate out of your food, but when the food is all close to each other, the steam starts to hit all the food that's next to it, and so the steam is actually what's cooking your food, and not the heat source that's in the pan with your the heat source that's underneath your food in the pan. So that's one of the reasons why you don't want to crowd your food, because you end up steaming it instead of sauteing or searing something, and that doesn't get you the same kind of effect. When you steam something, it will get cooked, but it won't have that delicious caramelized exterior that you really want with like a seared steak or sauteed vegetables. That's what you're looking for, so make sure you're not steaming your food by making the pan too crowded. All you have to simply do in order to avoid that is cook stuff in batches. So instead of putting everything in one pan, do it in 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 rounds to make sure that the food has enough space for it to cook. The next thing is, oh my goodness, I've got a big mess to clean up here after I'm done. Baby Leo made sure to help himself to all of my food. The next thing you want to do is, the next mistake you want to avoid is basically poking around, prodding your food too much, opening the oven, basically just kind of messing with the food too much, messing with the cooking process. Actually doing too much in the kitchen can slow things down and prevent the food from cooking the way that you want it to. So every time you open the door of the oven, you're letting the heat out. So you spent all that time preheating the oven, which you're supposed to do. Make sure you actually preheat the oven. Don't just toss food into a cold oven. Preheat the oven, because you'll get much better results. But once you've preheated the oven, you've got all of this heat inside the oven, so it's actually at the temperature the food needs to cook at in order to get the result that you're looking for. So you want to move as quickly as possible, get the food in the oven and close that door so that the temperature doesn't fall. And you want to maintain that temperature as much as possible throughout the cooking process. So you don't want to be taking a peek inside the oven, looking around. If you need to look inside the oven, use the oven light so that you can take a peek inside, but you don't want to be opening the door over and over again, because you're letting all of that good heat out. And every time you do that, the oven then has to start working harder to heat up again and bring the oven back to the temperature so that your food will cook at the proper temperature. So opening the door is a no-no. Don't do that if you can avoid it. You want to leave the door closed as much as possible until the food is ready to come out. Same thing goes for your food that is on the stovetop. If you're searing something, you don't want to be poking it and flipping it over and over and over again. You want to give the food an opportunity to actually cook, so that Maillard reaction that we talked about, that delicious caramelization that you want to happen, that can actually take place when you let the food sit there and the heat can penetrate the food and create all of those delicious flavors. So you don't want to be flipping your burgers all the time or flipping your steak all the time, poking and prodding, moving stuff around in the pot. Give it a little room to breathe. Just basically remember, don't do too much. You can actually just kind of sit back and relax a little bit and wait for the cooking reactions to happen, and that's how you get really good flavor in your food. And make sure that it cooks much faster, because when you're prodding and moving it around, you actually slow a lot of things down. And finally, last but not least, the last mistake you want to avoid is cutting into your food cutting into your meat right after it's done cooking. So if you take a steak or a piece of pork or chicken or whatever it might be right off of the stove or right out of the oven, and then immediately start cutting into that piece of meat, what you do is you release all of the juices that have been bubbling and cooking inside of the meat. And so you'll often see, as you cut into it, all of these juices start to drip away and fill up the cutting board or the plate as you cut into the piece of meat. And all of that juice, all of that moisture is what you want to keep inside the meat. That's how you create a really moist piece of meat, and that you have a nice juicy piece of steak or a nice moist piece of chicken. And so you want to avoid cutting into the meat until the juices have had a chance to settle down from their boiling point, come back into liquid form, and kind of go back into the proteins of the meat. And so let it rest. and you want to let it rest for about 5 minutes before you cut into it. And in that 5 minutes that you just let the meat rest, you'll actually keep a lot more of the moisture that's in the meat inside the meat and in every bite that you take of the meat versus spilling all over your plate or spilling all over your cutting board, because where you want it is inside the meat, where it's going to actually have all of the flavor and all of that juiciness in every single bite as you eat it. So those are the 7 mistakes that you should avoid in the kitchen. There's really simple things that I honestly still make some of these mistakes myself, like cooking things on high heat or crowding the pan, because I'm impatient just like everyone else. Sometimes I want things to go much faster, but I know that my results will always be much better if I take the time to do things, you know, the proper way, cooking things in batches or cooking things at the proper heat instead of trying to make things go faster. You'll get much better results. So just to go over those really quickly one more time, in case you're just joining me, I want to go over those seven mistakes that you want to avoid in the kitchen that will give you much better results all around. So the first one is the first mistake you do not want to do is don't add garlic with your onions at the same time in the cooking process. They cook at a different rate, so you want to add the onions first and add the garlic later. The garlic only takes about 30 to 60 seconds to cook. You basically, once you can smell the garlic, then it's time to move on with the cooking process, because you don't want your garlic to burn. Burnt garlic tastes bitter and it's not good to eat. And the next thing is not seasoning throughout the cooking process. You want to make sure that you're seasoning your food throughout the entire cooking process from start to finish, whether that's brining and marinating your food or just making sure you add salt and pepper before you get something on the stove, and then make sure that you season it at the end, taste it and see does it need anything else before you serve it. Which ties into mistake number 3, make sure you always taste your food before you serve it. So don't just serve the food without tasting it. Have a taste as soon as it's, you know, if you're cooking meat or something, like I know when I make ground turkey, I always taste it and see, okay, I added salt, does it need more salt before I mix in the other ingredients. Make sure you're tasting the food throughout the entire cooking process, because then you'll be able to balance out the flavors, add what it needs so that it tastes really good with the final product. The fourth one is cooking everything on high heat, which I've mentioned multiple times. You don't want to cook everything on high heat because a lot of foods cannot take that high heat, and you'll end up burning the outside of your food before the inside of the food is fully cooked. So you want to make sure you adjust the heat to whatever temperature would be appropriate for the item that you're cooking, whether it's a low temperature for something like a scrambled eggs, or a medium temperature for what you would cook. For most items, around a medium temperature works well, or it might be a high heat if you're frying something or you're trying to sear like a steak before you toss it in the oven to finish it. The next thing is overcrowding your pan. That's the mistake you want to avoid. If you crowd your pan, instead of getting a seared item or a sauteed item that has that nice caramelization, you end up with an item that gets steamed. So all of the water that's inside of the vegetable or the meat that you're cooking will start to evaporate, and that's what's cooking everything in the pan instead of the heat source that's on the bottom of the pan. And so you don't get caramelization, you don't get all of those tasty flavors that happen with the Maillard reaction. Instead, you get steamed food, which is fine, but not as delicious. So you want to make sure you don't overcrowd your pan. Cook things in batches, put less things in the pan, have a little bit of patience, and the results will come out much better. The next thing is opening the oven or poking and prodding and flipping your food too much. So don't do too much. Let the food sit. Make sure that you do not mess around with everything in the pan, or don't open the oven because you're taking out all of the good heat that's inside the oven and make the cooking process take longer, and will potentially affect the final result with your food. And last but not least, cutting into your meat right after it's done cooking. You don't want to cut into the meat right after it's done cooking, because all of the moisture and the juiciness that's in there will basically run right out of the meat, and then you end up with a dry food and it doesn't have as much flavor or moisture inside the food. So you want to let the meat rest after it's done cooking. You can let it rest for about 5 minutes. That will give the juices that are in there a chance to seep back into the meat and get all in throughout the textures and fibers in the meat, and it'll taste much better, and all the liquid will stay inside the food instead of on the cutting board or on your plate. So thank you guys so much for joining me. Thank you, baby Leo, for being here, being my little co-host, my adorable co-host. Thank you, baby. You can say bye-bye to the people. You say bye-bye. Yes. Thanks, everyone. I hope you have an awesome Sunday. And can't wait to see you guys again next time. Bye, everyone.